Hello, everyone. Welcome to Molding API Consciousness, Understanding Race and What to Do with It. Before we begin, I want to do a quick introduction. My name is Kent Tong, and I am the Associate Manager of Programs at OCA, Asian Pacific American Advocates, also known as OCA or OCA National. Founded in 1973, OCA is a 501c3 national nonprofit membership-driven organization based in Washington, D.C. with over 50 chapters and affiliates around the country. Touching hundreds of thousands of APIs each year, OCA works with its organizational partners, members, chapters, and supporters to empower the next generation of leaders. OCA's mission is dedicated to advancing the social, political, and economic well-being of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. By the end of this session, we're hoping you'll walk away with a better understanding of how race works and is shaped by other forces, how race affects one's own identity and one's relationships with others, and lastly, how to then lead and advocate for APIs given such knowledge. We'll first begin with the first objective, which is understanding how race works and is shaped by other forces. We're going to look at some racial theories to better understand how race and racial identities are formed. Racial formation theory was developed by sociologists Michael Omi and Howard Winant, which is used to look at race as a socially constructed identity, where the content and importance of racial categories are determined by social, economic, and political forces. This theory frames the meaning of race as rooted in context and history, something that changes over time, and not simply as a static and unchanging concept based purely on physical and genetic criteria. To understand the racial formation theory, we're going to look at three terms as defined by Omi and Winant: race, racial formation, and racialization. Omi and Winant define race as a concept that signifies and symbolizes social conflicts and interests by referring to different types of human bodies. According to them, race is both made up and real. It's made up in a sense that race is not rooted in nature. It's not something that reflects clear and discrete variations in human identity. Yet, despite not being real in a biological sense, race is indeed real as a social category that humans have created with definite social consequences. They define racial formation as the socio-historical process by which racial identities are created, lived out, transformed, and destroyed. Racial formation can be understood as the process of race making and its reverberations throughout the social order. In short, racial formation involves the various factors that contribute to creating and determining our individual racial identities. Racialization is the extension of racial meaning to a previously racially unclassified relationship, social practice, or group. Racialization can occur in large-scale and small-scale ways, macro and micro socially. An example of this on a large scale can be observed in the conquest and settlement of the Western Hemisphere, in which Europeans stole wealth, land, and labor from the Eastern Hemisphere, and the development of African slave labor, which required the creation of new racial categories, for example, white versus black or white versus Asian, to justify a new social order of domination and exploitation. An example of racialization on a small scale is racial profiling. Identity construction sites is a concept from sociologists Stephen Cornell and Douglas Hartman that proclaims racial identities are formed by various factors and in a variety of settings. Under this theory, race and ethnicities are products of social change and circumstances and of human interpretation and action. They are neither natural nor static identities, but variable, diverse, and contingent. Construction sites are arenas which can be both tangible or intangible, in which processes of identity construction occur. They've identified 6 sites of identity construction, which include politics, labor markets, residential space, social institutions, culture, and daily experiences. Politics refers to the government system that regulates laws and rules that either favors or discriminates against certain groups. These laws and rules play a large role in identity construction because it separates individuals into groups, minorities, and majorities. These laws and rules allow opportunities or constraints for certain racial groups, which then affect other aspects of their lives. It allows or does not allow people certain rights such as voting, immigration, education, citizenship, etc. It contributes to the construction of identities by creating an us versus them mentality. Labor markets refers to the job opportunities available to each racial group. Work is a universal human activity that is organized in nearly all societies in a variety of categories. Each society's division of labor offers associated statuses and rewards. As people are distributed into these categories, group identity construction is imminent. Many societies have what amounts to an ethnic or racial division of labor, in which certain occupations, industries, or kinds of work have become, for at least a time, the province of a particular group. Basically, the situational factors encountered by racial groups lead to a particular set of labor market opportunities for each racial group. Under certain conditions, these opportunities tend to produce racialized occupational concentrations. For example, African slave labor, Mexicans in the agricultural migrant labor market, Spanish domestic work, Vietnamese in fishing, Chinese in mining and railroad construction, and Filipinos in nursing. Residential space refers to geographical areas people choose to reside in or have no choice to reside in. Similar to labor markets, just as they are not able to always choose where they work, people are not always free to choose where they live. Many racial groups are discriminated against and are forced to live in certain, usually less advantageous, less ideal areas. Due to their low-paying jobs, these groups are forced to live in cheaper housing. Higher transportation costs and lack of accessible public transportation limit where people can work and where they can live. This discriminates against those of lower class as they have to try to live closer to work due to lack of transportation. And migrants may initially stay with family members or friends or live close to loved ones after moving out, leading to a large concentration of specific groups in specific residential areas. All of this limit residential freedom of choice. For example, redlining was the practice many financial institutions used to deny African Americans loans, keeping them from buying homes in white neighborhoods. These various restrictions in residential concentrations reinforce racial boundaries. Social institutions are where groups of people come together for a common purpose, such as schools, churches, etc. Social institutions are important for the construction of identity because they allow individuals to feel like they are part of something and also allows them to interact with others. If people do not have social institutions, they may be denied access to dominant institutions like jobs, housing, political participation, and schools, which can lead to a loss of identity. When people migrate, they may lose many of their social ties with institutions and need to build new ones. Culture. Individual or group identities can be impacted by culture. They may be impacted by how other groups see them, or more specifically, how the dominant culture is viewed them. Racial identities are impacted by the categories, classifications, and statuses that the dominant culture assigns them. The impact of culture on one's identity can be exemplified when we take a look at the past Cape Verde migrants. The Cape Verde Islands lie in the Atlantic Ocean off the western coast of Africa. Formerly a Portuguese colony, Cape Verde became an independent state in the 1970s. Both before and after independence, Cape Verdeans began migrating to the US, mostly in the Massachusetts New England area. Most of these immigrants thought of themselves as Cape Verdeans or as Portuguese, but they were viewed differently by the dominant society that they were entering, which is the US. In the dominant US culture, there was a Portuguese slot, but not a Cape Verdean slot, because Portuguese had been coming to the area for decades. So the New England area has a substantial Portuguese population. It would make sense to believe that these new migrants would fit in since they spoke Portuguese, but unlike the Portuguese, Cape Verdeans were Black. There was uncertainty in how to classify Cape Verdeans who were Portuguese-speaking Black people. Due to the significance of race in American culture, the Cape Verdeans were assigned Black. This had little effect on how the migrants viewed themselves, but it had an effect on their descendants, who grew up in a culture dominated by racial tension. Second generation Cape Verdeans, due to the influence of the dominant culture, began to think of themselves as Black. These categories defined by the dominant culture also establishes different statuses for each group. Power is intertwined with status. As status differentials between any two groups rise, the chances of intermarriage decline and the chances of discrimination against the subordinate group in jobs, housing, and politics rise. It is easier to exclude a group from sought after jobs, housing, or opportunities if that group is defined as somehow less worthy of those resources. Changes in status attributions have consequences for identity construction. For example, the Chinese in the United States were long viewed with contempt and were restricted to Chinatowns, excluded from many categories of jobs and industries. And they were often made fun of in pop culture. Much of that changed during World War II, when China became an American ally against the Japanese, and the Chinese people were turned into heroes by the American media for their resistance to the Japanese. In 1943, the US repealed the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which had restricted Chinese immigration. In subsequent years, job opportunities suddenly opened up to Chinese who previously had been denied them, and many residential restrictions were removed. Although Chinese still faced prejudice and violent discrimination, the distance across the group boundary had diminished measurably as the status of Chinese Americans rose. Status attributions may also encourage groups to adopt or resist certain identities. For example, in the studies of West Indian immigrants in New York City, some West Indians, particularly the migrant generation, resisted identification as Black because they hoped to avoid the negative stereotyping and racism that American society directs against African Americans. West Indians instead tend to emphasize their West Indian identity or to identify as Jamaicans, Dominicans, Barbadians, etc. For their children, however, racial classification in the dominant US society overwhelm all these efforts, and they gradually come to adopt the identity attributed to them by the dominant society, which is Black. And daily experiences refer to the many ways, large and small, that identities are signified, underlined, asserted, and reinforced through informal interactions that compose so much of the fabric of daily living. These range from suggestive but fundamentally disinterested behavior, the unthinking use of racial or ethnic stereotypes, to overt discrimination. Some of the messages in such interaction are unintended or of little significance, but others can be sent with stunning force. For example, in July of 1989, two white men pistol whipped a Chinese American named Jim Liu in North Carolina, mistaking him for a Vietnamese. Liu died 2 days later. This incident was one of the many attacks against Asian Americans by whites during the 1980s. The reasons behind many of these attacks were diverse, from resentment over the loss of the Vietnam War to perceived economic threats from Japan. Although some of these attacks were directed against specific Asian groups, others seemed indiscriminate, blaming Asians in general for an assortment of problems. Basically, it didn't matter what sub-Asian group you belonged to, you were considered Asian all the same. The accumulation of events had an effect. It sent a message to Asian Americans that said there was a significant boundary between them and whites. Such incidences were among the factors that encouraged the emergence in the 1970s and 80s of a politicized Asian American pan-ethnic identity, a sense of shared experience and fate among the hugely diverse Asian groups. Within all these construction sites, groups try to cope with the situations they encounter, make sense of the world around them, and identify themselves and others. Dominant groups control much of what goes on in these sites, shaping opportunities and constraints for them and others. Identity construction seldom occurs in only one site. It usually involves processes occurring simultaneously in many parts of the social order. These sites are often linked to one another. Politics, for example, may have an impact on labor or housing markets. Economic success by group members may persuade outsiders to treat them differently. And culture infuses all the arenas with particular ways of thinking and talking that have implications for cultural identities. Cornell and Hartman separated all these into 6 categories, not to say that they operate independently of each other, but to make clear the multidimensionality of identity construction. Now we'll move on to how race works in relation to other identities, specifically when it comes to Asian American identity in relation to whites and Blacks. Frequently, race is discussed in terms of a Black-white binary, but Claire Jean Kim's model of racial triangulation helps us think about race relations and how they have developed over time in a more nuanced way. In this theory, Kim argues that Asian Americans have been racialized relative through interactions with whites and Blacks. Kim maps this theory in a graph, as you can see. The x-axis represents each group's level of civic ostracism or the exclusion from a society or group. The further left a group is, the more they are considered foreigners. The more to the right a group is, the more they are considered insiders or American. The y-axis represents the level of racial valorization or value. The higher you are, the more you're considered superior. The lower you are, the more you're considered inferior. In this depiction, white people are valued the most, while Asians are valued less than whites, but more than blacks, due to racist assumptions that Asians have more desirable cultural values like hard work, family values, and mainstream success. But whites and blacks are considered insiders, i.e. American, whereas Asians are perpetual foreigners who are unable to assimilate to American society and culture. Racial triangulation has functioned as a blueprint and tool that reinforces white power and white privilege. I want to clarify that neither Kim nor I believe Asians are superior to Black people. Kim's model simply helps us think about how factors like cultural values and historical presence are wielded to pit Asians and Blacks against one another. If we want to dismantle anti-Blackness in our communities, we must understand how race works in it and be able to identify the tools of white supremacy. And now I want to take a moment and recognize that as helpful as Kim's model is, it is also not the most inclusive since it's specifically referring to Asian Americans and not to Pacific Islanders. OCA as an organization, we advocate for both Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. One reason that they are usually grouped together in society by the term API or APA or APIA or APITA is because both groups share a long history of European exploration and colonization. However, the two groups are very distinct. While Asian refers to a person with origins in East Asia, Southeast Asia, and India, according to the US Census Bureau, Pacific Islander refers to a person with origins in Hawaii, Guam, Samoa, or any other Pacific island. I highlight these differences because Pacific Islanders experience unique struggles related to sovereignty and decolonization that Asian Americans do not. Thus, it is important to keep in mind that as we use the term API, that we're not just referring to Asian American communities, but we are actively and meaningfully including Pacific Islanders. Language matters. So if you're only referring to the Asian American community or Asian American issues and identities, then be sure to say Asian American. If you're specifically referring to both Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, then you can use the various terms like API, APA, APIA, or APITA, or any other term. The term Asian American was coined by activists Yuichi Ichioka and Emma G in 1968 as a strategic unifying political identity for Asian ethnic groups to use as they resisted US imperialism in Southeast Asia, and white Americans' use of Oriental as a derogatory term for Asians in the US. Before the creation of the Asian American identity, people of Asian descent in the US would generally refer to themselves by their specific ethnic subgroups, such as Japanese American or Filipino American. When a broad term was used, it was often Oriental, which held racist and colonialist connotations. According to Ichioka, there were so many Asians out there in the political demonstrations, but we had no effectiveness. Everyone was lost in the larger rally. We figured that if we rallied behind our own banner, behind an Asian American banner, we would have an effect on the larger public. We could extend the influence beyond ourselves to other Asian Americans. By the 1980s, the US Census Bureau grouped persons of Asian ancestry together and created the category Asian Pacific Islander. In 2000, Asian and Pacific Islander became two separate racial categories. So as you can see, this is an example of race changing over time, and it shows how arbitrary and made up it is. So this is a short video that explains more commonalities and differences between two groups, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And it features voices specifically for Pacific Islanders. We're going to include this video link in the description and in this YouTube video so you can watch on your own. So now in this section, we'll address our second objective, which is gaining a better understanding of how race affects our own identities as well as our relationships to others. When thinking about how race affects our own identities, it can be helpful to think of how we perform our social identities. American sociologist Irving Goffman suggests that people perform social identities, including racial identities, like they act in a play. Except in this case, the performance doesn't stop when you walk off stage. He says you are always performing, whether front stage or backstage. Front stage performance can be imagined as if the world is the stage and people behave in a specific way depending on where they are and what is expected of them. According to Goffman, people engage in front stage behavior when they know that others are watching. Front stage behavior reflects internalized norms and expectations for behavior shaped partly by the setting, the particular role one plays in, and one's physical appearance. One's behavior in a front stage performance can be intentional or habitual. For example, it can include waiting in line for something, boarding a bus and scanning a transit pass, or exchanging pleasantries about the weekend with your colleagues. These are all highly routinized and scripted front stage performances. Whatever the setting of front stage behavior, people are aware of how others perceive them and what they expect. And this knowledge tells them how to behave. It shapes not just what individuals do and say in social settings, but how they dress and style themselves, the consumer items they carry in, the manner of their behavior, etc. And this shapes how others view them, what they expect of them, and how they behave towards them. Backstage behavior is what we do when no one is looking. When people engage in backstage performance, they are free of the expectations and norms that dictate front stage behavior. Given this, people are often more relaxed and comfortable. They let their guard down and behave in ways that reflect their true selves. For example, this may include swapping work clothes for casual clothes or loungewear, changing how you speak or how you carry yourself. When people are backstage, they often rehearse certain behaviors or interactions, preparing for their upcoming front stage performance. They might practice their smile or handshake, rehearse a presentation or conversation, or prep themselves to look a certain way once in public again. So even backstage, people are aware of the norms and expectations which influence what they think and do. Can you think of any examples of how APIs may perform front stage or backstage behavior? Some examples of front stage behavior may include making sure to speak English when in public, not bringing stinky ethnic foods to school lunches, or letting others mispronounce or butcher your ethnic name, or making a fake English name that's easier to pronounce. And some examples of backstage behavior is speaking your native language, eating your culturally specific food, or even using your ethnic name. Zooming out a little bit, we're now going to talk about how race affects your relationship, not just to yourself, but also to other APIs by considering identity politics. The term identity politics has been transformed and misconstrued from its original intention and meaning. It was originally created in the 1970s by the Combahee River Collective, a Black feminist lesbian socialist organization, and coined specifically by its member, scholar and activist Barbara Smith. What they meant by identity politics is that Black women have a right to determine their own political agendas. The reason the term was created was because back then it was not thought of that Black women had any particular political issues or concerns that needed to be addressed or worked on. The perspective back then was Black politics and Black liberation was one size fits all for both Black men and women, which isn't the case. What they meant by identity politics then was we have a right to shape our own political agenda that comes out of our own political identity. Today, the term identity politics has been co-opted by other parties, by the mainstream, and has taken on a totally different meaning. The definition given by the Merriam-Webster dictionary is politics in which groups of people have a particular racial, religious, ethnic, social, or cultural identity tend to promote their own specific interests or concerns without regard to the interests or concerns of any other wider political group. This new definition differs from Barbara Smith's original meaning, especially in that last part, where they say, without regard to the interests or concerns of any large political group. Smith believed in using identity politics to build coalitions with other groups. She said, you cannot be so immersed in your own particular experiences, your wonderful, multi-layered, complex experiences of your identity. You can't be so immersed in that you cannot look out at the person across the room, across the street, in another neighborhood, in another nation, around the globe. You cannot be so immersed in what you are experiencing that you cannot see the wider arc of a need to work for justice and do it in a coalition and in solidarity with others. What we're really talking about is positioning ourselves so that we can build a mass movement for positive political change and for justice. So when people think that the only people we're talking to are people who have the exact same list of identities that they have, I always say, why would I want to work with people who are just like me? That would be boring. We can see examples of this new interpretation of identity politics, the one defined by Merriam-Webster and used by most people today, Inaction in the issues of affirmative action in the model minority myth. While the latest surveys show the majority of Asian Americans are in support of affirmative action, many vocal Asian Americans still oppose it, and they believe that it harms Asian Americans as a whole, and that it gives Asians less chances and Black and Latino students more. This has led to lawsuits by SFFA, which is the Students for Fair Admissions, led by Edward Blum, a white man who is using Asian students who are against affirmative action to aid his efforts in dismantling affirmative action. They argued that Asian Americans are being punished for their hard work and academic successes due to this racial balancing. However, Asian Americans are not homogenous. They certainly do not all fit the model minority myth. High national attainment rates for Asian Americans as a single collective obscure very low college graduation rates and inequitable college success among certain Asian American ethnic subgroups. A 2014 report from the Center for American Progress in API data, for example, found that about half of Asian Americans hold a bachelor's degree or higher, but only 27% of Vietnamese Americans and 17% of Hmong and Cambodian Americans hold at least a bachelor's degree. While Asian Indian Americans, Mongolian Americans, and Taiwanese Americans attend college at a rate of approximately 85% each, Bhutanese Americans and Burmese Americans attend college at the lowest rates, 15% and 34% respectively. In California, which has banned affirmative action, top public colleges show similar disparities in attendance among Asian American subgroups. A study from CARE found that at UCLA, Hmong and Bangladeshi student applicants were admitted at a rate 13% and 10% less than the overall average rate for all APIs, while Taiwanese applicants were admitted at a rate of 8% higher than the combined average rate for APIs. These discrepancies are not new. Back in 2004, a study found that Filipino Americans and Southeast Asian Americans represented only 19% and 25% respectively of Asian Americans enrolled in highly selective institutions. Chinese American and Korean Americans, on the other hand, enrolled at higher rates of 35% and 38% respectively. The reality is many Asian Americans stand to benefit from affirmative action. Asian American communities face factors that play into lower college attainment, including poverty and a lack of access to high quality K through 12 education. Affirmative action benefits not just Asian Americans, but other groups too, like Black and Latino Americans. But when identity politics is used to focus only on the identities of one's own group, which in this case is those identifying as East Asian, and not in a way that builds coalition with other groups or even other Asian groups, it can be weaponized to harm these marginalized groups altogether. Another example of the new interpretation of identity politics is you can see it through former presidential candidate Andrew Yang's performance at the debates, in which he perpetuated the model minority myth on several occasions with jokes like how he knows a lot of doctors because he's Asian, or even to his math campaign slogan. I've already mentioned how diverse the Asian American experience is, including the disparities in education and income levels. And on top of that, the model minority myth is in effect when we look at the racial triangulation theory, which valorizes Asians compared to Blacks. The model minority myth ends up antagonizing both Asian Americans who don't fit the mold of a model minority, as well as Black Americans. To recap, the two examples of identity politics I've just gone over both end up harming and antagonizing other groups, both Asian and non-Asian. It's important to remind you that the affirmative action and Andrew Yang examples are specifically referring to the popular interpretation of identity politics. If you practice the original form of identity politics, the one that Barbara Smith created, and you should, it'll empower your specific identity group along with other oppressed and marginalized groups. And the reason I say all this is because when we think about how race affects our relationship to others, the others include not just other APIs, but other BIPOC communities. In order to become an effective leader and to dismantle white supremacy, one must have the ability to foster coalition building both within and across racial groups. We're going to move on to our last section, which focuses on how you can lead and advocate for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. There are so many different ways to lead and advocate for APIs, and of the many, Two courses of action include advocacy and lobbying. Advocacy is the process of stakeholders making their voices heard on issues that affect their lives and the lives of others at the local, state, and national level. It also means helping policymakers find specific solutions to persistent problems. Most nonprofits can and do engage in as much advocacy as possible to achieve their goals. Lobbying, on the other hand, involves activities that are in direct support or opposition to a specific piece of introduced legislation. While nonprofits can engage in some lobbying, the IRS has strict rules about what portion of their budget can go towards these activities. And some examples of advocacy versus lobbying. Advocacy include telling your member of Congress how a federal grant your organization received has helped your constituents, educating a member of Congress about the effects of a policy on your constituency, or a nonpartisan voter education guide. Lobbying can include asking your members of Congress to vote for or against or amend and introduce legislation. It can include emailing a call to action to your members, urging them to contact their members of Congress in support of action on introduced legislation or pending regulations. And it can include preparing materials or organizing events in support of lobbying activities. Another way you can employ your racial consciousness to bring light to specific API issue is through active art division. And this is a short video where some artivists explain what that means and how it can invoke change and action in viewers. So we're going to link this video in this workshop as well for you to view. And to clarify, artivism does not just refer to murals or to visual arts. It can include a variety of things such as music, dance, and more. So music. Yellow Pearl was a band that Chris Ajima formed with his friends and fellow activists Joanna Nobuoku Miyamoto and Charlie Chin. Shown here is a glimpse of some of the lyrics from their song, We Are the Children. We are the children of the migrant worker. We are the offspring of the concentration camp, sons and daughters of the railroad builder who leave their stamp on America. The band was formed to record the experiences of the first generation, to identify with the term and concept of Asian American, to connect to their cultural heritage and claim historical presence in the US, and resist marginalization, and to mobilize solidarity across class, ethnic, racial, and national differences to reshape a society reeling from war and racial equity. Their album, A Grain of Sand, Music for the Struggle by Asians in America, is widely recognized as the first album of Asian American music, equal parts political manifesto, collaborative art project, and organizing tool. This video demonstrates how dance, specifically the hula, is a form of oral history and storytelling. So we'll link this video for you as well. Another example of the importance of the hula and its importance to culture is through Kim Hee Wong, who was a student in the 2018 Columbia University Oral History MA program. She centered her work on the personal and professional paths of Native Hawaiian female leaders of the 21st century. She sought to share the aloha spirit in hopes that it will live and carry on. She realized the hula is more than just a dance activity or a cultural practice. It is central to the perpetuation of Native Hawaiian culture, language, and identity. When she dances, she sees herself as a vessel for her ancestors and their stories. She feels their presence within as she connects the past and present through the stories she shares. And here's a quote from the founder of Red Clay Dance Company that summarizes how art can be an effective medium for API advocates. Ward explains, an artivist is someone that uses whatever tool they have, whether it be dance or music, to fight against injustice. It's an artist that has accepted that responsibility personally and wants to lead a group of people into collective responsibility. The Red Clay Dance Company was created to awaken global change through creating, performing, and teaching dances of the African diaspora. Change that transforms cultural and social economic inequities in their local and global community. To recap, we discussed how race works and is shaped by other forces, various racial theories, and the origins of the Asian American identity, the similarities and differences between Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, how race affects our own identity and relationships with others, and different ways we can use our identities to advocate. Now that you have the understanding and tools, I hope you feel a little bit more confident in discovering your own identity and how to use them to implement positive change in the community. Thank you. And if you ever want to reach out to me, have any questions, or just to talk to me, you can feel free to reach out to my email at kent.tom@ocanational.org. Thank you.